ጤና ይስጥልኝ dear viewers, this is Professor Brooke Hailu Beshach from Now TV. Our program is called Diplomatic Corner, and today I'm really honored to have the golden opportunity to interview the Assistant Foreign Minister, the Honorable Tim Watts of the Commonwealth of Australia. Your Excellency, welcome to my show. And thank you for agreeing to appear in my show.
Well, it's a pleasure to join you here in Addis Ababa.
Thank you. I understand that you came a few days ago to attend the African Union summit. Is it your first time in Ethiopia?
No, it's not my first time. It's my first visit as the Assistant Minister for Foreign Affairs, but I came as a parliamentarian in 2017.
I see.
Spent a few days in Addis, had some great injera, and then visited that amazing World Heritage site, Lalibela, and told all my friends and family.
Wow, great. So I'm glad. Welcome back then to Ethiopia, although in a different position. How is the meeting so far? Have you met some Ethiopian leaders and other African high officials?
So I'm here for the Africa Union Summit, and one of the benefits of coming when the summit is on is that there are diplomatic representatives and ministers from obviously countries all across Africa. So we've had a very full dance card talking to my counterparts in other African countries about issues of mutual concern. And I'm here because Africa matters to Australia. You know, we might be geographically a long way away, but Australia has global interests, and we care about the same things that the African Union cares about.
Very true. That will take me directly to one of my other questions, and that is really Australia is one of those key countries that has a policy of really accepting, embarrassing a globalized world, you know. In that sense, you know, what are the pillars of His Excellency the Prime Minister Albanese's government's foreign policy and diplomacy towards Africa? And what are highlights of these relations with the African Union as well, Your Excellency?
Sure. So the new Albanese government was elected 9 months ago in Australia, and we've said that our focus in our foreign policy is our immediate neighbourhood, the Indo-Pacific, and that's unsurprising. Most countries focus the majority of their attention on their immediate neighbourhood. But one of the things that we've also said is that Australia has global interests, and to respond to global problems, we need to engage globally. So increasingly, that means engaging in Africa. We know that Africa has around a quarter of the seats in the United Nations, that by 2050, a quarter of the world's population will be African. So if we want to respond to the challenges at a global level that affect Australia, things like climate change, like international security and the rules-based international system, growing prosperity around the globe, we need to partner with African nations in order to realise those goals, and that's why I'm here at this year's African Union Summit.
Great. And of course, last year you visited Morocco in the north, Ghana in the west, and South Africa in the south. How did it go, your visit to these key African nations? And of course, next week you're gonna, not next week, after your stay in Ethiopia, you're going to go to Kenya, I understand.
Yes, that's right. So the first trip, it showed me really how much we have in common with African countries. In Morocco, I visited the UN Office of Counter-Terrorism training facility that Australia provides significant support for, and Australian Federal Police staff share counter-terrorism expertise with law enforcement officers from across West Africa. And talking to them, it was really clear to me how much we had in common in this fight against terrorism in the Sahel and Western Africa.
Very good.
Very similar to the kinds of contests that we've had in Southeast Asia in the past. So Australia's gotten significant expertise working with countries like Indonesia in combating terrorism in our own region. It was really interesting to me to see how that translated into Morocco. Across the rest of the continent, it was very clear to me how Africa, like Australia, is particularly exposed to the challenge of climate change. You know, our economies have significant agricultural components. Our countries are on the cutting edge of being exposed to the impacts of climate change, so drought and flood and these more extreme weather events. So we shared a deep interest in adaptation, building resilience, and on combating climate change.
Great. Now, regarding terrorism, Your Excellency, this part of the world, that's northeastern Africa, the Horn of Africa, is plagued with terrorism, like Al-Shabaab is still alive and kicking, as one says in America, really. And also in the West, Boko Haram. These terrorist groups, Al-Qaeda chapters, and the Islamic, the former ISIS remnants of that groups, they are still around, especially in Mali, in Burkina Faso, in Niger, and really making grounds, etc. And since we have one world and we live in a big ship, and everybody is concerned, and it's good to know that Australia is committed to fighting terrorism. How is Australia's position in regard to terrorist groups in this part of the world? How do you plan to help Horn countries and the like?
Well, Australia's position is clear that terrorism in any form, anywhere, is completely unacceptable. And one of the things that I think you know about terrorism that we learn from experience is that it's generally transnational in character. Terrorists don't respect laws, they don't respect borders, they don't respect international boundaries. So because of that, it's important that nations work together in response to the terrorist threat. So that can be sharing intelligence, but it also can be sharing expertise and capability. And that's the approach that Australia takes. We want to be united with other nations confronting this threat. And that's why we provide $5.2 million of funding to the International Counter-Terrorism Academy in Côte d'Ivoire.
I see.
Again, training up the people on the front lines responding to this threat. We view that as a global challenge, and Australia wants to play its part.
Great. When talking about terrorism, there is a cause and effect kind of relationship. And academicians, researchers, analysts, politicians, experts, they talk about, drying the swamp, because these youth who are helpless or who have no vision, they need help, things like that, they get into easily, they are easily manipulated and get into this kind of terrorist activities. How do you see this comment made by researchers as drying the swamp?
Well, I think
is that the right approach in a way? Yeah.
Well, I think that it's correct to say that there are a number of drivers that help feed terrorism. So if we look at the Sahel, for example, it's clear that the climate situation there and the destruction that it is causing to people's ability to make a livelihood and to live off the land is feeding the kind of economic alienation that might cause young people to turn to extremist ideologies in response. So, if we're taking a comprehensive approach to terrorism, we're not just thinking about law enforcement, we're not just thinking about the intelligence and security side, we're also thinking about building resilient, inclusive economies to ensure that people are able to provide for themselves, to have long-term aspirations in their lives, so that young people are able to dream about a future that they can build for themselves and not are about destroying the society that they live in.
Giving them a future and giving them some microfinancing in some countries, trying to create jobs, empowering women, empowering the youth.
I'm a big believer that you need to give young people a stake in the society that they live in, that you need to ensure that young people believe that they want to build the society that they live in, not tear it down because they have a greater interest in building it up than tearing it down. So I do think that economic resilience and inclusion initiatives are an important part of the response here.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Wonderful. Next, I would like to ask you about, Australian companies. Australia belongs to the top group of countries, and there is an estimated 40 billion in investment across Africa. If you could give us a rundown of this, where, in what industries and the like.
So there are a couple of very significant industries that Australian companies export to Africa in. So Australian companies invest a lot in the mining and resources sector in Africa. We have a very significant expertise in that space from in Australia, and there are Australians and Australian companies applying that expertise across Africa. So I've met with Australian mining company representatives in South Africa or in Ghana, from top to bottom of the country, and I think that's one area where it's not just in the interests of local communities, but I think the whole globe that Australian companies succeed, because for something like critical minerals extraction, for example, the whole world needs Australian resources companies to succeed that, because we're not going to be able to respond to climate change without the critical minerals that go into battery manufacturing, into solar panel manufacturing. So it doesn't just benefit local communities, it doesn't just benefit Australian companies, it benefits the whole globe if we succeed in critical minerals extraction. Australian companies have very significant expertise in the agriculture sector as well, and I've seen the commonalities between the agricultural landscape in Africa and in Australia. Some very arid climates, but also one of Australia's most significant export industries is in education. And I've been very encouraged to see Australian universities considering locating campuses in Africa to help reach that very significant youth cohort in Africa and to serve that market. We know that those young Africans, they aspire to education and they aspire to jobs, and Australian universities have trained young people from all the way around the world.
I used to work at the Foreign Service way back, very senior position like an ambassador and things like that. So I remember 2 or 3 of my colleagues, they studied in Australia, believe it or not, Your Excellency.
That doesn't surprise me at all. We have people from all the way around the world coming to study in Australia. Indeed, our Foreign Minister, Penny Wong's father, first came to Australia as a student. So this is a long pathway in Australia, and it's really part of our national fabric now.
Great. Thank you. Economic aid and assistance. Australia is very cognizant that we live in a world where we need to help each other, and Australia has a great experience, historical experience as well. Economic aid and assistance, what are the cornerstones and what are the principles? Because there is a debate saying that, nothing is for free, one says in America, Economic aid is given, to really be impactful, to make the population, say, African country X, to be engaged. How do you see that, this debate and polemics as well?
I think it's worth drawing a distinction between development assistance and humanitarian relief assistance. So when there are humanitarian catastrophes, crises, like we are seeing in the hunger crisis in the Horn of Africa at the moment, I think humanitarian relief is a necessity in order to preserve life. So the Australian government has committed $25 million directly to the Horn of Africa crisis in relieving hunger, as well as the very significant annual funding that we provide to agencies like the World Food Programme and the UNHCR, who are also providing very significant assistance in response to that crisis. So that kind of relief funding, I think, is it's essential, regardless of any ideological underpinnings. I think development assistance, it is important to think about the long-term impact of the way that you're providing development assistance, and that's why Australia has a number of focus areas in the way that we provide development assistance. So one of those focus areas is in women. We believe that if we invest in gender equality, if we invest in the empowerment of women economically and politically, then you get much greater dividends than just the direct investment in that individual. Because we know that empowered women provide for families and for children and the stability of a broader community, not just that individual. It's also why we invest in climate change resilience and adaptation. We know that instability and insecurity often comes from the climate change that we're seeing at the moment. So investing in communities' abilities to be resilient in the face of that change and adapt to the changing environment that they're encountering is also a really significant long-term investment that we can make to assist the development of communities.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Your Excellency. Now I'll be moving to conflicts, lack of peace. Really, then that's the number one problem in Africa and other developing countries, leading to instability, conflicts leading to dislocation, even IDPs, the internally displaced people and the like, and that will bring me to what happened in Ethiopia. We just came out 3 months ago, Your Excellency, of a very bitter internal war fought in the northern part of Ethiopia and the Tigray province. And now the guns, we have silence, but still there are so many things to do. What's the position of Australia regarding this conflict?
Well, we support African-led solutions to African challenges, and there are a couple of things that fall out of that. So first, our Foreign Minister Penny Wong at last year's United Nations General Assembly meeting made it clear that we support permanent African presence on the United Nations Security Council. We think when you look at the agenda of the United Nations Security Council, it's important that there's permanent representatives from Africa on that Security Council, and that we move to text-based negotiations for that. But also, it means that Australia will support African-led solutions to challenges like the very serious conflict that we've seen here in Ethiopia. So I was very encouraged, and I publicly welcomed the Pretoria Peace Agreement. I think the leadership that former Nigerian President Obasanjo and former Kenyan President Kenyatta, as in addition to the South African government and critically the African Union, provided to that process was really fundamental and critical to the success so far and the encouraging progress that we've seen in that peace agreement. So in Australia, it's been something that's been of significant attention in Australia, and we are encouraged by the early progress that's being made, and we'd encourage continued progress in the full implementation of that peace agreement, including transitional justice arrangements across the nation.
It was a difficult issue for other countries to understand, because it was felt it was an internal matter, one province trying to break away, and then typical government, legitimate government would say, the territorial integrity of the entire nation. That's the cornerstone of the UN and any international organizations. Now we have peace, of course, making up to finding a solution. Now we have the big job in that resettlement, humanitarian assistance, things like that. You have already referred to significant amount of American dollars that Australia is going to hand over or give to the Ethiopian government, either via WFP and other specialized agencies. How about conflict, let's say conflict transitional justice or conflict resolution experts, maybe any ideas that Australian experts would come over here and maybe share their knowledge?
So the first thing to say is that we're under no illusions that while the peace agreement is a welcome development, that the humanitarian situation remains really acute, and that we see around 2.5 million people who are still displaced as a result of that conflict, around 12 million people in need of humanitarian assistance. So, as you say, that's part of why we provided the $25 million in humanitarian relief for the Horn of Africa hunger crisis. In terms of on the ground process, I think the thing to say is that this process is going to be most effective, I think, if it has a dialogue and buy-in from all the parties inside Ethiopia. There can be a risk that good-natured people from the outside might not understand the whole context, might make things more difficult. So I think in the first instance you want to see those processes led from within the country.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Now I would like to move over to the Pacific region. My question is, I was reading lately, the question was, is Australia an Asian country? No, it's not. Is Australia a Pacific Rim country? No, it's not. Is Australia a Polynesian country? No, it's not. And then it says Australia belongs to Oceania as well as New Zealand. How, if you could enlighten our audience, because most people feel it's Asia. Thank you, Your Excellency.
Well, I like to think Australia is Australian. I think we are an exceptional, unique country. There's a great Indigenous Australian leader named Noel Pearson.
I see.
And he says that you can't tell the story of Australia without telling three stories. And that's the story of the tens of thousands of years of Indigenous heritage of the Indigenous First Nations Australians, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Secondly, the Westminster traditions that the British brought with their arrival. And then thirdly, our multicultural migration, the enormous migrant flows have come to our country and so enriched it in recent years. So Noel says that you can't tell the one story of Australia without telling those three stories together. And I think that's really apt. So I find that sometimes people can have outdated stereotypes or misconceptions about Australia and that they're surprised when they hear that 50% of Australians, 1 in 2 Australians, are either born overseas or have a parent who was born overseas. That we're home to 300 different ethnic heritages, including, I should say, very significant communities from Africa. We have nearly 500,000 Australians of African heritage now, and we saw that on full display at the recent FIFA World Cup, where 4 members of the Socceroos team that have advanced to the knockout stage were born in Africa.
African descent. Wow.
That's modern Australia.
Wow, interesting. Great. I mean, so it's a diverse society, really. Very diverse Australia.
Absolutely.
Even Ethiopian is a vibrant Ethiopian community.
There's a very significant Ethiopian community, including in the area that I represent in Melbourne. So when I come to Addis, I like to say that there are 5 different injera restaurants in the suburb that I live in. Absolutely.
Wow.
So I'm very used to that. And in the suburb that I live in, there's a very significant Temket celebration every year. So, you know, I've been baptised, you know, had the water poured over my head as part of a Temket celebration. So that's natural in Australia. We celebrate festivals from all the way around the world because we have people from all the way around the world in our community.
Wow. I understand that in your constituents, the Ethiopian community are vibrant and they have their own restaurants, their own churches, and you also attend Timkat. Yeah.
That's right. We have a very significant Ethiopian Australian community in my hometown in Melbourne. Many different injera restaurants where I can compare what the best dish is. Very significant Temket celebrations where thousands of people attend. And it's a natural thing that we'd celebrate something like Temket in Australia because we also celebrate Eid and Holi and Ramadan and Christmas and celebrations from all around the world.
All of them. Wow. Great. Giving them a second chance, by the way. From experience, the diaspora community in America, in Canada, I bet in Australia, New Zealand, and in Europe as well, they because of the political instability in Ethiopia in the 70s, they went all the way to Australia and New Zealand, and Australia welcomed them and gave them a second chance, a new home.
Sometimes that's the case. I mean, sometimes migrants come to Australia searching for freedom and for democracy and opportunity that they didn't have in their home country. But there are lots of reasons that migrants come to Australia. You know, some come for work, you know, their employer will send them there. Many come for love, you know, they fall in love with an Australian and move back there. So we welcome many people from all kinds of backgrounds in Australia.
Great. Your book, The Golden Excellency, The Golden Country, you know, Australian Changing Identity. And then your second book as well, co-authored with another member of parliament, you know, Honorable Claire O'Neill, I believe. Yeah, 2 futures, Australia at a critical moment, trying to look forward to 2040 something. It's quite fascinating, really. You know, it's the melting pot. Another America, maybe. What do you think? Is Australia going to become another America? Because America is the melting pot as well. You know, everybody is there in America. You know.
Well, I mean, I have enormous respect for our American friends. There are a few differences between Australia and America, though. You know, I think you know, our universal healthcare system, gun control. You know, there are a few things that are different between Australia and America.
Absolutely.
But I think, the immigration story in Australia is one that people don't know as well, and that's why I told that story in the Golden Country, because I was looking at the statistics, and Australia had one of, if not the highest immigration rate in the OECD for more than 20 years. And that had really changed the composition of Australia. It had really changed the way Australia looked. And we like to think that has an effect on our foreign policy as well, because that diversity connects us with every corner of the world. You know, an Australian minister can turn up in Addis Ababa and have something in common with everyone that they meet. And Australian members of parliament talk to their local community members from all the way around the world and are connected directly with every corner of the world in a way that we didn't used to be. So we say that our foreign policy begins with our identity, it begins with who we are, and modern Australia is an incredibly diverse place that is connected with all corners of the world.
Indeed, very much so. Indeed, Your Excellency. Australia, there are so many countries in your neighborhood, I will say, even the greater neighborhood, The list is long, so many fascinating island nations, like Cook Island, we know it from history, like the Federated States of Micronesia, Fiji, French Polynesia, Kiribati, Nauru, Tuvalu, all this Papua New Guinea as well, Samoa, Tonga, Vanuatu, Wallis and Futuna. I read, and Australia is really engaged in economic, giving economic assistance, expertise, education, and everything. If you could really, share something with our audience, I'll be thankful.
Sure. So the Pacific Islands is it's an area of the world that outsiders might not know a lot about. But Australia, we consider ourselves as part of the Pacific family. We are a very big island in the Pacific. And we are really enmeshed with the Pacific region. So again, in the community that I represent, we have many Pacifica people, people from the Pacific Islands who live in my community. We share a passion for the same sports. We share passions for the same religions. So we are deeply enmeshed. The Pacific Islands have a very significant development challenge. They have great ambitions to grow their economies. One of the ways that we are doing that is, through development programs, but also through migration schemes. So we have a Pacific Australia labour migration program that allows Pacific Islanders to come and work in Australia for a period of time, and that's a very significant source of remittances to the Pacific Islands.
Very true.
To give you an indication of the scale, around a third of Pacific Islanders live on less than $1,000 a year. The average remittance provided by a worker under that Pacific Island Labour Mobility Program is $18,000 a year. So it's utterly transformative, not just for that individual, not just for their family, but for their whole community. The other thing that's really important to know about Pacific Islands is because of their geographic situation, they are about the most passionate advocates for action on climate change that you'll see anywhere in the world. These are countries that are on the front line of raising sea levels, already experiencing salination of their water supplies and significant droughts related to climate change. So we want to elevate Pacific Islands voices in the world, and one of the ways that we're seeking to do that is by seeking to host one of the Conference of Parties coming up, the COP31, as the Pacific Islands COP. Elevating their voices and sharing their priorities for action on climate change with the rest of the world.
Rising of the sea coast, is really very, very damaging in the future. So many island nations, even coastal nations, and it's something has to be done.
Climate change is a serious threat for all of us, but it's an existential threat.
Together, something has to be done despite territories, sovereign nations, rich or poor, developing or developed, living in one, as I said already, one big ship, too many holes in it, the blue planet, as it is so wonderful, it's going to be very, very dangerous. Let me move to, APEC, the Asian Pacific Economic, Community. And Australia plays a key role in that. America is a member, of course. Japan, the heavyweights, of course. Australia, Japan, and even Peru, Chile, and scores of other countries. So far, since 1981, as it was founded, how far have this group of nations made achievements?
APEC was a very significant grouping of economies that wanted to come together to increase economic integration, to facilitate free trade between those countries. It's been very successful, I think, in pushing that agenda. And indeed, I've reflected on some of the successes that APEC has had in terms of reducing both tariff and non-tariff barriers to trade in conversations I've had here at the Africa Union Summit on the African continent free trade area, that trade integration agenda on the continent. It's a similar journey, I think, that countries are on, and I'm very interested in sharing learnings from Australia's experience as a free trading nation, as part of a number of trading groups, and the continental, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement.
That was my next question. Yes, great. Yeah. What can Africa learn from that? At least, in a very measured way. Africa is not Australia, of course, but this free trade, it's not an experiment; it's a reality. What takeaways do you see? What Africa should focus on when Africa wants this have started the African free trade area?
I think the first thing to say is that there are significant benefits from free trade. So benefits not just in terms of opening up new markets for exporters, but also benefits in increasing the productivity of domestic suppliers. We've seen that trade-exposed industries become more competitive because they have to compete more intensely. We see benefits in cheaper products being available to consumers in markets, and that increases the overall efficiency of an economy and producers in other sectors. So I think that African countries are absolutely on the right track with the African Continental Free Trade Area. And the level of enthusiasm from heads of states to signing on for this agreement, I think it's the fastest, the most quickly ratified agreement in the African Union history. That really symbolises the hunger there is to realise those economic benefits of trade on the continent.
Yeah, very true. Inter-African trade is just less than a third, even less than 20% or something. And Africans among themselves have a lot to gain. And one way to achieve that will be a free trade area. And the excitement is there. And Agenda 2063 is also there. So the 60th year. Now I'm wrapping up. I'm more or less coming to a close. And that is, Australia rugby, things like that. I mean, do you play sports, Your Excellency?
I certainly do. In fact, I'm the convener of the Australian Parliament's Friends of Basketball group.
Basketball?
Yeah.
Wow.
We have many fantastic basketballers from Australia playing over in America, so it's something that we are particularly good at as Australians. We won the bronze medal in the Olympics as well.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow, that's great. And
a team, I should say, with Indigenous Australians, with migrants, with refugees, a team that looks like modern Australia, competing on the world stage and winning.
Yeah, and you have shared me minutes ago about the FIFA, this coming August 2023, FIFA, and I believe it's jointly organised with New Zealand, or?
That's right, the Women's World Cup coming up in Australia. It's a great opportunity to see the world's best women's football players on the big stage, and there is no women footballer better than Australian Sam Kerr. She is the greatest living player, I think the greatest player of all time in the women's sport. So come to Australia to compete. You'll have some stiff competition.
Really? Great. Thank you. We'll be watching FIFA, definitely. I'm a football fan, and soccer and FIFA is watched highly. Now, family, if I may ask you about that, you are married with children. If you could share with us, Your Excellency, your family. You have children, I believe?
Yes. I mean, my family is a regular Australian family. So I was talking earlier about half of Australians either being born overseas or having a parent born overseas. Well, my wife was born in Hong Kong, so my kids have one parent born in Australia, me. And
it's a global family.
It's a global family. It's a normal thing. So my kids grew up speaking Cantonese with their mum and English with me, and it's a normal story of modern Australia.
Do you speak other languages?
Well, I studied Mandarin through to high school, but it's very poor.
You are very humble.
As a local parliamentarian in Australia, you learn a couple of sentences in a dozen different languages. Because you move through. The electorate that I represent has very significant Vietnamese, Indian, Chinese, Greek, Italian, Maltese, South Sudanese, Ethiopian, communities from all the way around the world. And I find that if you learn just a few sentences in each of those languages, it's just a good manners.
Agree. Now, Your Excellency, you have the last word, if I may. What do you like to say to the Ethiopian audience who will be watching you, and also your Australian constituents as well? I'll give you this opportunity, Your Excellency?
Well, the one thing that I want to say is that Africa matters to Australia, that we want to work together on the big global challenges that we all face. So climate change, security, growing the prosperity of all. And Australia, as a modern, diverse country, we feel connected with Africa through our diaspora communities, through our Ethiopian communities. And we want to use that connection as a touch point to work together on these global problems.
Yeah, so be it. Your Excellency, thank you for your time. You have really indeed a busy schedule, but out of that, you are so generous to give me this opportunity, to me, to my staff, to Nahu Television. It's a private one. Private TV has come to Ethiopia 4 or 5 years ago. It's new into the scene, and there are already about 18 TV stations. And for us, it means really a lot. And we do hope to see you again, sir, in the coming years, on another visit, coming to Ethiopia, to Africa, maybe for pleasure as well, maybe once again. So thank you, Your Excellency, once again.
I'm certain that I will return.
Thank you. A pleasure. We'll have you. We'll be waiting for that. Ladies and gentlemen, that was His Excellency Tim Watts, the Assistant Foreign Minister of Australia, the Commonwealth of Australia. He had discussed with us so many issues, and we wish him well. He came for to attend the African Union meeting, and we were really fortunate to have him with us. Next time I'll be bringing another high dignitary to our audience. This is Professor Brook Hailu Besha. I take leave of you, Nahu TV, Diplomatic Corner, along with His Excellency Assistant Minister Tim Watts. Thank you, Your Excellency.
Pleasure.
We say au revoir to you. Bye-bye.